Hi, this is Kalamas Arts, and today I'm going to be talking about the basics of writing your first novel. This comes from a lot of things I've learned personally as I started writing my first novel around 2 years ago, which is just now being finalized for publication, going through the processes of making the cover, designing the interior, and all that fun stuff. So, why might you want to write a novel? This is a question I've gotten a lot over the years, and there really isn't a simple explanation for it. I think that writing a novel is a way of telling your own story, incorporating themes from your life, really being able to give the world a message. I love storytelling and reading stories, and sometimes verbal storytelling might not really be your thing, which is when you turn to internal storytelling, which would be a more solitary process of writing your own plot. I also think that writing a novel is definitely a huge accomplishment. If you're an aspiring writer or you just really like to read, I think it's a huge goal, and I honestly wouldn't have thought I would be able to write a novel until I actually did. Today, there are also so many platforms to help you generate ideas, plan and organize, and write on, which is something you should really use to your advantage. Also, with the whole publishing process, sometimes your novel might not be accepted to publishing presses or wherever you send it, but there's always the backup plan of self publishing through Amazon, so you can publish it either way. I'm not publishing my novel independently, instead, I'm publishing with a press, but I know a lot of people who have self published and have had really positive experiences with it. Also, kind of a given, but it will definitely improve your writing skills. You're writing, reading, editing, just using a lot of brain power constantly. And honestly, after my process of writing a manuscript, I find it a lot easier to generate ideas for my writing. I write a lot faster too, and there honestly have only been positive benefits for me. So, how to start? Honestly, this is the hardest part of writing a novel because since it's such a big project, you're just kind of all over the place and not really sure of how to even begin. So, obviously, timing and planning are super important, especially when you're writing a whole book. My first tip would be to build a writing schedule, which will turn into a habit. I think it's really easy to have an idea and get into it really enthusiastic and kind of burn yourself out from the start, which is exactly what you don't want to do. So, setting aside an hour or so every day or week to sit down and write your novel without any exceptions is definitely your key to success. My second tip is to set up a writing space. I found that sitting at my desk and just typing for such long periods of time kind of bored me and made me not as excited to write. But once I switched my location of where I would write, I found myself a lot more excited and in tune with my writing. It might not be in places you would expect, like my top two places where I would write are on my unfolded couch with a bunch of pillows in a dark room, which might not sound that appealing but really got me writing. And also the pool. I would sit outside on a sun chair and write for a few hours. So I honestly do think location is a huge thing to consider, especially because I found myself more efficient in some places compared to others. My third tip kind of ties in with the first one, which is to write a little bit every day. I could not emphasize this more because once you get into a writing mindset and grind, it's like a streak. And if you break it, it's so hard to get it back. I've made this mistake of not writing every day and telling myself, oh, it's okay, I'll write tomorrow, which never ended up happening. This had led me to spend weeks, even months, without writing a word. But when I got into the groove of writing every day, even if it was just brainstorming or like one page, I was so much more efficient and connected to my story. This leads me into my final tip, which is to set up a word count or chapter goal. Holding yourself accountable and even forcing yourself to write will help you a lot. And even though you might not enjoy it as much at first, future you will thank yourself. Okay, so now we're getting into the characters. To me, this is probably the most important part of writing a novel. You want to have compelling characters, someone that readers can really relate to, or hate, or just feel something towards. It's pretty amazing to be able to create your own person, essentially, with a backstory and feelings and all that stuff, and having compelling characters will earn you a lot of readers and make your story a lot more interesting. So, my first tip is to establish your character's goals and motivations. This will make them more human because everybody, to some extent, has goals and motivations, and these will ultimately guide your story and how it pans out. I would also keep a journal or document with brainstormed ideas about your character. This can be little things like favorite foods, their least favorite movie, just a lot of tiny or big ideas that will make your character more like an actual person. For my process, I just kept a notes document with a bunch of bullet points and random quotes, and I found that making a Pinterest board or a vision board of what you want your character to look like and kind of the vibe they give off to people makes this really fun and super helpful. My third tip is to make sure a character has both strengths and flaws. You don't want your character to be too perfect, and you don't want them to be too unlikable either. Having a balance will make your characters more relatable to the reader and easier to judge, which is exactly what we want. So the fourth tip is really fun. It's just to develop physical characteristics. This is probably one of the first things you do when creating a character along with naming them. This helps you envision them, especially when you're writing about them in a scene. Since appearances can really make a person more unique, I would suggest really honing into that, such as maybe giving them a birthmark or certain hair color, or just a trait like maybe they get sunburned really easily. This will make your character fully formed and really stand out. Okay, so now we're moving on to the plot. So you might have seen like a graph of all the plot points in a story in an English class that goes up in a spike and then drops. So these are all the little points on that graph that are the skeleton to building your own story. So first off, we have the exposition, which is another word for introduction. This is the beginning of the story where you will introduce your character and the background, as well as the setting and any key points of the plot. Next, we have rising action, where the conflict is originally revealed and the plot goes from static and easygoing to overcomplicated, kind of overwhelming the story for a while. This will lead right up into the climax, which is the turning point of the story and peak action. This is the giant point you see when this is graphed out because it is the highest and most anticipated moment and it can only go down from there. So next we have falling action, which is the beginning of the resolution where complications finally start to fall into place, which leads directly into resolution, the final events of the story, and hopefully brings the plot full circle, unless you're planning a series of books and maybe you want to end on a cliffhanger or unresolved plot points. So now that you have the basics, I'm going to get into the styles of writing that you pick and choose from and maybe experiment with before getting into the actual process. So first we have writing point of views. First person is the one I'm most familiar with and also the point of view I wrote my novel from. This means the narrator and protagonist are the same, and the narrator speaks as I blank, I did this, I said this, which puts the reader directly into the protagonist's shoes and shows them their inner thoughts, which is why I chose to use this and probably my favorite one. Second person is when the narrator speaks to the reader like, you did this, you said this, which honestly, I've never read a book like this, and I'm pretty sure it's very rarely used. I wouldn't recommend this to beginners because there aren't a lot of examples to work with, and it's pretty complicated to use. Third person is when a narrator is a storyteller, speaking like she did this, he said this. This is also very commonly used, but I do prefer first person because it places the reader into the character's shoes rather than building a wall between them. The next one is not very commonly spoken about or taught, but it's a mix of the first and third point of views. This would just be like a few passages in first person and a few in third person, which could work depending on your story and how you want to tell it. Next, we have writing tenses. I'm focusing on the two main ones when writing a novel, present and past tense. Present tense is immediate and may be restrictive to some writers because of this. An example would be the statement, I walk across the room, which would be a first person present tense. I wrote my novel from the present tense because I found it really immersed myself when reading, and while it can be restrictive at times, I really love the experience of writing from this point of view. Next, we have past tense, which are the majority of books I've read, and a lot of books I consider classics, like Twilight and Harry Potter. An example of something from the past tense would be, he grabbed an apple. This point of view works because although it is in the past tense, readers will be so immersed in the story that they will be able to read the action as if it's happening now. I do think this is easier to write in than present tense, so if you're a beginner and aren't really sure of which way would be better to tell your story, I would recommend past tense. So that's it for this video and my tips on starting your first novel. I hope this was helpful and you're able to incorporate some of this knowledge into your process, and good luck writing!